Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello, and thanks for tuning in. I wanted to let you know that this interview was recorded a week or so before the presidential election. And because the topic is about parenting and healthy kids, had it been recorded more recently, we certainly would have touched on the Make America Healthy Again report and initiative. But because of the timing, obviously, we did not. But I am planning some upcoming episodes to touch on MAHA and other related topics, so please stay tuned for that. And thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, and welcome to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about parenthood and how to think about various parenting challenges and questions from a justice and science-centered lens, with, of course, a focus on food. My guest today is Kavin Senapathy. Kavin is a science and health writer, parent of 2 middle schoolers, and author of The Progressive Parent, Harnessing the Power of Science and Social Justice to Raise Awesome Kids. She is a member of the American Society of Journalists and Authors and the National Association of Science Writers. Welcome to the show, Kavin.
Thanks so much for having me again, Melissa.
Yeah. So you were on the show quite a while back in 2019.
Yes.
Talking about food, pseudoscience, and science moms.
Yeah.
So I'm excited to have you back. We've kept in touch over the years and want everybody listening to know that this episode is not sponsored, but I did receive a copy of your book. So thank you so much for that.
Yes.
For those of my listeners who haven't heard that previous episode or are not familiar with you, I would just love for you to share some information about your background and the work you do.
Yeah, I've been told that I can ramble a little bit on this answer. Yeah, so I'm a parent and science and health writer and journalist based in Madison, Wisconsin. And of course, since I'm a health writer, health and food go hand in hand. So very interested in it. And that's what led me to the world of registered dietitians and getting to know people like Melissa. I'm fortunate to work as a science writer for nearly a decade. Science and health writing was pretty much my dream job for years before I even knew it could be a profession, which it's interesting. I encounter many science writers who didn't realize that you could be a science writer. So to give you an idea of myself, when I was in high school, I won the Wisconsin statewide medical spelling bee. And then I was also in my school's poetry and prose writing club. I'm a proud member of the high school graduating class of 2000, which makes me an elder millennial. And I don't know if you've noticed, but elder millennials are known for proudly telling you how old we are.
That's great.
I've always loved reading and writing, which is a big reason I majored in English at the University of Wisconsin. But I didn't start writing about science and health until many years later in my 30s, when I was a parent of a toddler and an infant at the time. I'd gone through some particularly tough mental health struggles in pregnancy and postpartum, and specifically anxiety and postpartum OCD.
Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about that. But after a year or two of starting meds and therapy, I was working part-time and had the opportunity to start contributing to a new parenting blog, which was called Grounded Parents. And delving into all of the context and science around any parenting question and writing about it became almost a coping mechanism for my anxiety in some ways. So long story short, it turned out that science writing is a good fit for me. So I started doing it for several outlets professionally. So it's funny, now I get paid to indulge in this particular coping mechanism, not only with parenting, but with everything to do with life that, that an anxious nerd would wonder about. So over the years, I've done quite a bit of on and off the job learning and training on everything from editorial fact checking to delving into various realms of health and life science related research, genomics and human health, diseases, and so much more. So I've spoken with a slew of experts and regular people in my reporting and just learned so much from them, and food often has so much to do with it. I enjoy writing for and write for a slew of clients and outlets. People can find some of my work in outlets like Slate, Undark Magazine, Scientific American, and one of my most favorite clients is SciShow, which is an awesome YouTube show, educational show by Complexly, which is an educational production company founded by brothers Hank and John Green, who are these prolific YouTubers. And I'm a freelancer, so listeners, please do hit me up if you have a need for a science or health writer. And then, yeah, of course, definitely, my biggest project to date is my book, The Progressive Parent, Harnessing the Power of Science and Social Justice to Raise Awesome Kids. So yes, that's what brings me back to the Soundbites podcast for a second time.
Yeah. Well, I was so excited that you reached out to me about this. And I had seen some posts about the new book on social media, but yeah, I'd love to have you back on the show. And, at first I thought, okay, got to crack this book open and see what's in here. And we have way more that we could talk about, but between you and I, we've kind of agreed on maybe the most important aspects that we want to touch on.
Yeah.
And interestingly, I have several podcast episodes related to some of the things that we're going to talk about. So I found that, I guess, a bit surprising, but I guess I shouldn't be surprised. I just didn't know what to expect from the book. So that was really cool. And this is your first book, right?
Yes. Yeah. It's my first. I've contributed book chapters and co-written a book or two, but this is my first solo book. Yes.
Wow. Okay, great. What inspired you to write this?
Yeah, for sure. It's a kind of slow growing inspiration that has come to fruition over time, I guess you could say. There's just so much unsolicited advice in the world of parenthood. So, the last thing I wanted to do is give a whole bunch of prescriptive parenting advice. So I'd say what initially inspired me is being, again, really so familiar with the fear that comes with loving children so fiercely. And I've learned, both as a parent and a writer, that scrutinizing the parenting wisdom and guidance is really so much more challenging than it looks. So the concept for the book was about 80% this big picture take on the connections between the issues I've covered in my years of work as a science writer and journalist and my experience as a parent, and 20% assignment from my publisher to cover certain questions. But I would say really on top of all of that, my biggest inspiration has been the people, whether it be activists, community organizers, researchers, doctors, who are all out there doing the work to bring together science-based, justice-based ways to make the world better for young people.
Excellent. So let's start with an overview of the book. What can people find in it?
Yeah, I've heard from some parenting writers who read many parenting books that it's not like any parenting book they've read. So I would say, again, there is some prescriptive advice in the book, which only takes up a fraction of the pages, and the rest is more about how we can position ourselves as parents and other adults in any given situation based on our varying sets of values, many of which we share, and with the resources and information and bandwidth that we have available to us, and given all of the information, facts, and science where it's applicable. So looking at the table of contents, it might look like the chapters are about a wide range of unrelated issues. So everything from bodily autonomy and ableism and fat phobia to clean eating and living to greenwashing to vaccines to beginning to navigate race, ethnicity, and ancestry. So again, what really ties all of these together are those threads of science and social justice. So for Soundbites listeners specifically, I would say a good chunk of the book, maybe even half, is either directly about food or related to food and children's well-being. You know, all those things are so related.
Yes, and obviously we're going to focus on at least some of the food-related content. It's interesting how much of it does relate back to food. One of the questions I had, though, before we do that is, what is the connection between justice and science? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. So I would say, as someone who loves science myself, you know, who reads scientific research for fun and nerding out purposes, I've learned that when people think about science, they think about this conceptual science that lives in a vacuum and resembles what we call the scientific method, which is often presented as a flowchart that features a few steps that include hypothesis, experimentation, observation, analysis, and repeat. For instance, like if you've taken a physics class or even a science class, you may have been taught to think of, when you're thinking about a surface, you think of a frictionless surface to consider things that are happening on that surface. But when science plays out in the real world, it's messier, including all of the stuff published in peer-reviewed journals. Hypotheses can be misguided, and experiments and observations can be biased. So the major connection between science and justice is that because injustice and inequity are woven into all systems and institutions and policies, that injustice directly affects science itself, and it definitely affects the scientific messaging that parents receive.
Okay. You have this really compelling analogy in the book about science being more like lanterns than being like the sun. So I'd love for you to share that.
Right. So the sun is something that we don't have control over. The sun simply is there, and it sheds light evenly on everything. If you're outdoors, for instance, and there's no cloud cover. But a lantern or a flashlight is something that somebody holds, they have control of, they own, and they choose what to illuminate, from what angle, and to whose benefit. And so that analogy in the book essentially points to people's idea of science being something that sort of indiscriminately sheds light on everything evenly, you know, with no agenda or motivation, versus the way that science really happens is that it's wielded by individuals, and those power dynamics affect everything.
Right. And being aware of, I guess, this shift in perspective, or just like the realities of that, is a good place to start, because it impacts how you see research. And, you know, we're not here to say like, oh, just all research is bogus and just throw it out,
not
throw
at
the baby
all.
out with the bathwater or whatever. It's like when we talk about different types of biases, cognitive biases, confirmation biases, are things that we want to be aware of so that we can appreciate the nuances in the bigger picture.
Right. In a way that affects us and affects children. So, yeah, for sure.
You also brought up this idea of science curiosity instead of science literacy. So I'd also like for you to explain that.
This is really neat. And so I get excited when this resonates with people who read the book. So as I argue in the book, science is another layer to scrutinize when facing any big question to which there are empirical answers. And again, there's probably nothing more fraught with big questions than parenthood and kids' well-being. So in doing so, I talk about in the book something closer to science curiosity than science literacy alone may be more valuable for parents. So science curiosity is a term introduced by a team of researchers headed by Dan Kahan, and he's a professor of psychology and law at Yale Law School. And his team sheds light on the distinction between science curiosity and science literacy, which I go into in chapter 1 of the book. But one interesting finding is that in his team's 2017 paper on science curiosity and political information processing, he and his co-authors look at why some people are more likely to engage in what's called politically motivated reasoning. That's this tendency to latch onto information that fits one worldview and discard evidence that contradicts it. So that's an important question to researchers because ostensibly we want to be able to grasp the body of evidence about any science-related question to inform worldviews and decisions. So scholars are interested in who is more or less prone to this tendency to sort of cherry pick information to suit their views. So until recently, this idea of scientific literacy, or the ability to grasp a news story, for instance, about a scientific matter and make out what it means, was thought to make people less prone to this type of fallacious reasoning and thinking. But this research actually suggests that the opposite is true. So science literacy on its own can contribute to polarization. So roughly, in other words, those with a basic understanding and knowledge of science can use it and are likely to use it to bolster their existing agendas and discard what doesn't suit their narrative, even if their narrative is inaccurate. And science curiosity is not the same thing. It's this ingrained desire to seek out scientific information, to satisfy curiosity. And this type of curiosity may prevent or protect against the type of, fallacious cherry picking I mentioned. So the question of how to instill this science curiosity in individuals is up in the air. There's no evidence-based boot camp, right, to train people to be curious, even though that sounds great to me. I would take that. But it may be a somewhat innate quality. But as I go into in the book, curiosity is always something to strive for as parents and really, as I'm sure, as dietitians as well.
Yeah, I like that. So a lot of what you're saying, it sounds like a version of confirmation bias. And again, just being aware of that and having that curiosity kind of sounds like you're just being more open to whatever you find versus seeking those things that reinforce what you already thought.
Right. Of course. Yeah.
Sounds healthy. All right. So let's delve into some of these more food-related aspects in your book. I'd like to start off with breastfeeding, infant formulas. You talk about some misconceptions about infant feeding. And I just have to say, whether we get into these stories or not, because a lot of the book is about your personal experience. You mentioned earlier your mental health struggles and postpartum depression and different things that really have led you on certain paths, to seek out more information and solutions and connect with other people on those topics. So again, whether we get into these stories or not, my breastfeeding story was very similar to yours, and even our birthing stories were eerily similar. So let's talk about the breastfeeding and infant formula.
Yeah, so I was certainly among the millions of parents who are led to believe that exclusive breastfeeding, that is only human milk for the first 6 months of an infant's life, is the best way to feed your baby and is superior to formula, and that all kinds of better outcomes in the short and long term when it comes to not only health, but achievement, sort of. And I was convinced that I needed to breastfeed. You're kind of scared to ever use formula to feed your baby because then you're told that your milk supply will dry up and your breastfeeding relationship will be ruined. I can paraphrase a pediatrician I spoke with who is one of the more fed is best friendly type of pediatricians as opposed to the breast is best school of thought. He says, people are led to believe that all of these outcomes are dependent on exclusive breastfeeding, but the pressure to do so really just doesn't line up with the facts and the science. And so really, breastfeeding or not breastfeeding is not going to make the difference between like your kid pole vaulting for Yale and struggling to make ends meet, right? The reason that we're told that breastfeeding is so much better, and this ideology has been around since the 90s, along with the advent of a global organization known as the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative, which is part of the World Health Organization and UNICEF. So the thing is, worldwide data for decades has shown that breastfed infants do fare better when it comes to certain outcomes. Short term, it's like respiratory infections and a few other outcomes. Long term, it could be anything from certain types of cancers, a lower risk, or heart disease, or obesity, which is a whole other. And that is because of the issue with all of this data about breastfeeding versus formula feeding and outcomes. And that is that when it comes to like drugs, you do a randomized control trial to see what the outcomes are. But with infant feeding, the data are almost all observational. That means researchers look at groups of people and they look at infants that are formula fed versus infants who are breastfed and then look at the outcomes. And in the developed world, for instance, in the United States, people who exclusively breastfeed their infants or who breastfeed for longer periods of time tend to be of higher socioeconomic status, be in stable co-parenting relationships, and all these other factors that go along with that ability to exclusively breastfeed. So those are just some of these confounding factors, and confounders, of course, is another concept the book goes into. But overall, if you really look at all of the data about infant feeding and human milk, there isn't any reason to believe that human milk causes superior outcomes or that safely manufactured, safely prepared infant formula is a bad choice. It's a fine choice for the vast majority of people with access to it. And the book also goes into how none of this is to let the formula industry off the hook, because it certainly has behaved in predatory and unethical ways. And there are still, of course, problems with the industry, and there are people putting pressure on the industry and the regulators for good reason. But the formula industry being problematic is not justification to pressure everybody in a universal way to exclusively breastfeed their baby or else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The book does get into some of the information you're talking about with regard to this predatory behavior, as you say, without getting into the long story, but it has to do with developing countries and access to safe water and having moms use this formula and then not being able to have access to it, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean,
right.
That's it very much in a nutshell, but just wanted to kind of explain that a little bit. Even as a registered dietitian, knowing that formula was totally fine, definitely got the message that breastfeeding was best. And it wasn't until my baby, my son, I had him in 2008. He weighed less at 6 months than he did at 4 months.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, and I was exclusively breastfeeding. And that's when I started to supplement. But there was probably like a 24-hour period where I was kind of freaking out with, like, not that formula was bad, but my biggest fear was that, like you said, like if you're not nursing, I mean, my milk supply was never great. But then if you're nursing less or you're not nursing, then the milk supply goes down even more. And then when you try to nurse, then the baby, I just thought this is going to be a horrible, my baby is going to be so upset that there's no milk. And then, of course we had bottle fed him, when I had pumped, but, like, what if he doesn't like the formula or whatever? It's just like, and then 24 hours went by and I had a sense of relief that I didn't have to be the sole provider and just stress about every single ounce that I pumped and count up is it, it's in the freezer, or is that enough for the amount of time that I'm gone? I mean, it's just like crazy.
And then the power might go. If the power ever went out, the first thing I worried was the
that
freezer.
liquid gold.
Yeah, I should mention an organization known as the Fed is Best Foundation. I would say they are among the real experts on how to safely feed infants by, if you want to exclusively breastfeed, how to avoid that risk of not only weight loss, but other, related complications that can be pretty bad, and how to use formula. Because usually, for the most part, you're not taught how to use formula. So if you have to use it, if it becomes necessary, many people don't know how. Mm-hmm. And so the book talks about this organization as well. And they also have a book out called The Fed is Best Book. And it's excellent. I think it's like really creating change.
Well, yeah. And to your point with these confounders or these confounding factors, I talk about randomized control trials versus epidemiology all the time on the podcast. And it's like these confounding factors are enough there to make us stop and think, okay, this Fed is best mantra versus the breast is best, because the positive outcomes come from a fed baby, versus underfed children.
And then
babies.
The positive outcomes come from privilege, really. And it's easier to prescribe people to exclusively breastfeed than to increase access to everything that actually creates better outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I've talked about this on the show before too, is I even had, my best friend was a dietitian and lactation consultant, so she was giving me all the best tips, and overall I had a really good experience, but here was the plain fact that it wasn't enough to feed my baby on its own. So also I have a related episode on the shame of infant formula that I think, ties into this and can supplement this conversation as well. If people are interested, I'll have the link in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. So let's move on to clean eating and the idea of these quote unquote no-no lists. This, I feel like it's been around for a while. I'm kind of hoping it's going away, but I'm curious where you see this popping up or persisting and how you suggest people navigate this.
Sure. So these no-no lists of ingredients or additives to avoid in food are often promoted by certain chains and grocery brands. And the idea is that these lists of additives, if you avoid them, then you can avoid exposing your children to these toxic chemicals that will harm them in a slew of different ways. And avoiding those chemicals kind of gives parents this sense of control about what we're exposing our children to. So there are all kinds of ingredients on those lists. And listen, if lists of ingredients from MSG to food colorings and others would really help keep kids safe and healthy, then I would be totally behind them. But the book goes into examples of items on these no-no lists and whether avoiding them really helps and whether it really helps your child on an individual level. Does avoiding something help on a systemic level or a community level? But yeah, essentially these lists, they provide more of an illusion of control than real control.
Yes, there's certain like restaurants or foods that come to mind with this topic. And I won't name names, but there's one in particular, and I have to check and see if they're still doing this, but I've talked about this on the show before. There was a particular frozen food company that, due to pressure from their customers for, a clean label, like, fewer ingredients on the label, they were not fortifying their pasta that was in these frozen dinners.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And like, so normal dry pasta is fortified with B vitamins. It's just, maybe people don't know that. We think pasta's pasta, right? So when I was touring this plant, this topic came up, and it was just one of those times where I just thought, this is crazy, because you're literally taking vitamins out of a food or not putting them in, I guess, when we're talking about enrichment and fortification. Sometimes you're replacing something that was lost during processing, or you're adding something like vitamin D to milk that's fortifying. You're putting something in that wasn't there before. But I digress. My point being, it's not like you're removing some random additive which actually may have a purpose, like to prolong shelf life, or to even sodium in products a lot of times is there to make the food safer. But a vitamin, something that was there for all of those things, are probably there for reasons. Yeah. But my point being, it's like that was just really surprising to me, is like, wow, this is maybe an unintended consequence of people wanting these clean labels. So a lot of that, obviously is public perception versus the science and what's really going on. But that makes me think of that. Do you have any other thoughts on this? Like, other than us just trying to reassure people that our food is safe and that there's a reason for these different ingredients, getting more food scientists to communicate about some of this would be great. How do you approach this?
Yeah, so when we look at these no-no lists again, for instance, or the idea of clean eating, let's think of an ingredient that's on most of these lists, high fructose corn syrup, for instance. Mm-hmm. When I, as a parent or someone who cares about what kids eat, think about high fructose corn syrup, say giving my kids a snack with that ingredient on the ingredients list and their friends are over or whatever, am I worried about feeding them this ingredient, high fructose corn syrup? If I think about it, if I look at, I don't know, like I'm assuming graham crackers or some of them have high fructose corn syrup, I'm not worried about them eating it. Mm-hmm. Am I worried about high fructose corn syrup and the sheer amounts of it that people consume and the sheer amounts of corn that are grown for various reasons that are arguably not very healthy for children and communities? Maybe. And so I would say that for people who are communicating about answering questions about clean eating, again, the question is just if a child has access to and consumes plenty of fruits and vegetables and nutritious foods, then the corn syrup or the MSG, for instance, is barely a blip on my radar anymore as someone who is genuinely a concerned parent who cares.
Yeah. You brought up MSG, and I was going to bring that up because that's one of the examples in your book. And as you know, I did a 3-part podcast series on MSG. It was when I had gone to a conference and learned about some of the xenophobic roots of MSG, and I actually had met you there in person. We met on Twitter, definitely back in the day, I will say, and then we got to meet each other in person there. I'll never forget that. That is something that you talk a lot about as well. And I think that would be a great example to just share briefly with our listeners about something that might seem like a scary ingredient and the very sciencey explanation, and how it really originated from a racism perspective.
Right. And this is one of those examples where you really do have to scrutinize the process of science itself that led to this widespread notion that MSG, which stands for monosodium glutamate, is harmful when consumed. So many people, even despite lots of messaging now to correct these misconceptions, MSG is often viewed as this artificial, lab-made sort of ingredient that makes the flavor so irresistible that it addicts us to unhealthy food like potato chips and Cheetos and fast food. And I remember years of my life when I would ask for no MSG restaurants because, as you mentioned, the xenophobic history, which the book goes into, and again, there's a whole episode on this because it's so really interesting, and it's almost like a xenophobic like saga.
History lesson.
Yeah. So I was surprised to learn that glutamate is a naturally occurring amino acid and that it occurs naturally in all kinds of food and is actually MSG is responsible for the flavor that we call umami. And that it is in certain foods that we would consider unhealthy, but it's a seasoning. It's naturally in tomatoes and cheese, but the science itself is interesting. For instance, you'll hear that the science shows that the MSG is responsible for all kinds of health problems or symptoms. And then it turns out that the science itself was kind of poorly done rat studies exposed to MSG in a way that would not at all resemble how, say, I might use MSG, or actually I should say my husband, because I gotta be honest, he cooks more, but he would put it in a pan of vegetables or stir fry or soup or anything like that.
Yeah. And I'll just say one more thing and we'll move on to the next topic. But the xenophobic aspect of it being they thought MSG caused Chinese restaurant syndrome and caused all these problems. And the irony is it's a Japanese ingredient, but there's a lot of ironies here. But there was a letter to the editor in the New England Journal of Medicine that really sparked a lot of this fear and racism, which just kind of part of our history, I guess. But anyway, I did a 3-part series on this that I spoke to an author, I spoke to a chef, a dietitian, actually 2 dietitians. One's a dietitian, one's a PhD in food nutrition. And the same week I released that, NPR's This American Life released an episode talking about MSG and that letter to the editor. I'll have links to all of that in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com, and I really encourage people to take a listen to that. I did want to also just touch on, at least briefly, hazard and risk. And you have something that you can explain to us about risk jars. It's the way of explaining hazard versus risk. Because I think that's something that when we talk about science and understanding whether it's the research study itself or what we see, the headlines or an article, a lot of times hazard and risk get completely mixed up and conflated sometimes.
Right. So the book goes into the difference between hazard and risk. So a hazard is anything that could cause harm. It's a really type of particular distinction. So for instance, a grape is a choking hazard, and the risk of choking is the likelihood that someone will choke on the grape. So certain factors influence the risk of choking, including age. Toddlers have a higher risk of choking on a grape, which is why the good advice to cut grapes into quarters for toddlers is good advice that I practiced myself. And the book goes into this, but a big way that hazard versus risk is confused in the media is when the International Agency for Research on Cancer, or IARC, which is a specialized agency of the WHO, categorizes substances as cancer-causing. And so IARC slots various agents, including lifestyle, occupational, environmental exposures, into categories based on their ability to cause cancer. So group 1 is for what they call established carcinogens. That includes smoking, for instance, asbestos, alcohol, and processed meat. And then the next 2 tiers, probably carcinogenic and possibly carcinogenic, are for substances with a less certain causal relationship with cancer. And group 3 is for substances that can't be classified due to lack of data. And so when people think of a hazard, they often think of it as this sort of binary, like either the hazard is the person gets exposed to it and then a bad thing happens or not. But as I touch on in the book, there's a specific paper about the risk of a specific disease, and that paper introduces the concept of a risk jar. So let's take whether it be a specific cancer or Alzheimer's disease, which is what this paper refers to. Everybody is born with certain genetic risk factors for any given outcome or disease. So again, let's take Alzheimer's. Some people have more of these genetic risk. In the paper, this risk jar is described as being filled with beads. And when these risk beads hit a certain threshold, that's when the disease develops. Again, yes, so going back, people are born with a certain number of beads in each risk jar, and then environmental exposures, stress, all can contribute beads to this risk jar until a person does or doesn't develop that outcome. So like, for instance, not everybody who is exposed to the sun, everyone's exposed to the sun because we need the sun, but not everyone who goes out in the sun gets skin cancer, but some people will. And so what happens is IARC has famously categorized certain herbicides in group 2 as carcinogenic. And so then the notion, or what people are led to believe, is that food that comes from crops grown with that chemical must therefore be cancer causing. So in the book, I talk again about hazard versus risks with an example that I kind of came up with. We'll call it the International Agency for Research on Cuts. So let's say this agency similarly categorized agents that can cause cuts. So razor blades, scissors, printer paper, knives, glassware, chainsaws, guillotines would all be in group 1 for items that are known to be cut causing to humans, right? But the risk of cuts from exposure to any of these hazards varies widely, even though we know all of them could cause cuts in various situations. So yeah, so we keep knives and glassware in our kitchen, even though they could potentially kill a person, but we probably don't keep katanas, you know?
Right. We could do an entire episode on PFAS or forever chemicals. So I would love for you to just very briefly touch on that topic, if it's possible.
Yeah, we hear a lot about these forever chemicals, which are chemicals that have been used in manufacturing of various goods over the decades. And the problem is they persist in the environment, right? So it's like a huge, daunting, much bigger than we could totally delve into in this episode. But this is one of those chemicals that does really concern me, but the question is how to avoid them and how much control we have when it comes to avoiding them. One researcher I spoke with for the book was essentially saying that we hear that we should avoid XYZ to avoid PFAS, but really it's like everywhere. Like she would actually be shocked if something did not have a measurable level of PFAS in it. So in terms of just touching on it, I would say it's super daunting if we think of it in terms of avoiding exposure to what's dangerous, in this case, PFAS. The book also talks about combating some of those exposures that we have less control over with what is called helpful or health-promoting exposures. When we look at anything that's sort of bad for our health, we can look at chemicals that we're exposed to in the environment, and we can look at, for instance, stress and the chemicals that our own body releases in response to stress and the harm that that can cause on our body. And it's always this exercise of weighing those two, right? So sometimes instead of stressing over the fact that there is PFAS everywhere and we really need the government and industries to fix this, which again is a huge, hard problem that the book goes into, if we can focus on positive exposures, which are, again, fruits and vegetables and good health care and green spaces and clean air and, you know, good times with loved ones, those can all protect against some of those exposures that we have less control over, whether it be, again, high fructose corn syrup or the very scary forever chemicals. And again, the book also talks about privilege and how something like PFAS and avoiding it often comes down to how many resources we have.
Right. Yeah. It's just trying to connect some of those social justice dots. And it makes me think of when you said, like, how much control do we have? Let's touch briefly on that whole concept of, like, recycling was a big example of this, like where the onus is put on the customer to, well, you should do this and you should do that, when really corporations have a lot of power and a lot of opportunity to move the needle. And I know there's challenges. I actually have a related episode on recycling that the more you learn about it, the more it's like, oh my gosh, this is not, there's no easy solution here. It's kind of a mess. But I know that that's part of the social justice aspect of your book is, let's not just put everything on the individual. Now, there are things, and actually that's a question I have for you when it comes to food, where does individual responsibility matter? But if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's really surprising to me, and it's hard for people to let go of it. But the book talks about a concept called wish cycling, which is this phenomenon of individuals putting items in their recycling bins and the city taking, collecting your recycling, and just imagining that it goes off to a better life, where it's remade into something useful. But the book and your episode probably touch on how a lot of this is actually industry propaganda, including the triangle symbols that we see on our plastic products. I was just with a family member this weekend who was putting something in the recycling bin, and I said, "Oh, you can't recycle that." And she says, "It has the triangle on it." And as I learned in speaking with experts and researching the book, only those with the 1 and 2 on the triangle can be recycled and have any real chance of being turned into something else useful. And there are all these other details about the industry. So again, it comes down to this question of whether doing something that is putting something in the recycling bin, whether it's recyclable or not, it might make us feel better about our consumption. But is it really for the better, and is it really worth the effort? And then the book also, of course, the whole book tries to be as non-judgmental as possible. So when it comes to single-use plastics, for instance, you see when I go to the grocery store, I see the plastic containers of cut fruit. And I used to even have this idea, which I later realized was problematic, that people who buy this cut fruit might be lazy because they're not cutting their own fruit. and now they're using this single-use plastic, and they should feel bad about themselves, right? So then the question becomes, is it really the person who's buying some cut fruit in plastic who's ruining the earth? Yeah.
There are bigger fish
right.
to fry, right? There are bigger sources of,
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Along those lines of judgment or making assumptions about people, let's talk about fat phobia. You have a section in the book on fat phobia and some really enlightening information about BMI that I'd love for you to share.
Sure. So fat phobia is basically the notion that body fat and or the concept of body mass index can tell us not only about someone's health, but ultimately their character. And this type of judgment is woven into everything, including education and medicine. We're raised with fat phobia and have it reinforced all around us. And so it blew my mind to learn that trying to hold people to a normal BMI is just not helpful. It's actually hateful. And it's also just not accurate to assume that a fat person is unhealthy and that any of their health problems are attributable to their weight. So underlying the science of all of this is the belief that there is such a thing as a normal, healthy weight. And we hear that all the time. And body mass index itself was first coined in the early 70s, but the concept behind it has been around for a couple hundred years. And I talk about this Belgian mathematician named Adolf Quetelet, who devised the index in the mid-1800s as part of his study of what he called the average man, which looked at a slew of human traits. And together, this model average man with all of these traits that fall into the norm represented the ideal. So called Quetelet's index, this concept, which eventually morphed into BMI, was based on the measurements of small groups of people that he looked at, namely Western Europeans. And so by the turn of the next century, these studied traits ended up being used as scientific justification for all kinds of horrific events, including sterilization of disabled people, autistic people, people experiencing poverty. But it wasn't until the insurance industry came along that the concept of BMI started to be applied to individuals as an indicator of health. So life insurance companies created tables of height and weight to calculate what to charge policyholders in the early 20th century. And then without really scientific backup to justify it, physicians also began to adopt these measures. And by the mid-80s, the National Institutes of Health had revised its definition of obesity to be tied to individual patients' BMIs. But it's just not true. And the media consistently reinforces that, again, that it's a matter of personal responsibility. And certainly children are not aware of this history, and it's generally not taught in history class. History largely shows that when people aren't subjected to famine, humans have naturally come in a spectrum of all shapes and sizes. And there have always been fat people who we would consider healthy by most typical measures, and thin folks with health problems. And then there's the whole issue of consideration of the conditions that influence body fat, like discrimination and stress and lack of sleep, green spaces, and how all of this has made, again, mothers and parents a main target of this sort of misguided war against obesity, and how that war against obesity has really affected children for the worst.
Yeah, absolutely. As we're wrapping up, we've talked about some examples and the doom and gloom, but you mentioned briefly, that you aren't scolding people in this book. I don't remember exactly how you said it, but I did want to reiterate, it is very detailed in some of these different examples, but you have an encouraging tone and you have a kindness that is definitely worth noting and spreading that message. So I would love for you, in wrapping up perhaps, to kind of share your vision of how this book can help parents, be less stressed, less anxious, maybe get some perspective on some of these issues, but also how to have more of a positive outlook through this science and justice lens to care about all children, not just their own.
Right. I would say that overall, summing up what the book wants people to do is to stay aware of the systemic forces that harm kids. And again, this outsized onus for individual parents to take control of their kids' health and well-being. You hear that all the time, do X, Y, Z and take control of your kids' health, take control of their future. But sometimes, spending the energy and time and money on doing something that seems healthy for kids, like, say, avoiding ingredients on a no-no list, that time and energy and bandwidth may be better spent doing something that actually protects your kids, like, again, making sure they're eating enough fruits and veggies, or doing something that brings them joy, or to actually help kids in your community or anywhere, like pushing for free lunches or donating to a worthy local cause or volunteering if that's your thing. So I think what the most hopeful thing about this book is that it helps people know how to look at parenting and differentiate what they can and can't control and whether something's worth controlling, and if so, how to actually control it versus how we're told we're supposed to control it.
Excellent. Thank you. I know people can find more about the book and follow you. You have a website, you're on Instagram, Facebook. So if you want to share some of that as we're wrapping up.
Yeah, my website is kavinsenapathy.com. My Instagram is kavinsenapathy. And I recently just joined Blue Sky. So I haven't posted on Blue Sky yet, but it sounds really promising.
I've been hearing about this. The Great Migration.
Yeah.
Yes, and I will have the links to your website and your social media and your book in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. And I do want to add, you have more than 35 pages of references in your book. So people, there are citations, and she shows you where she's getting all this information, and you just put it together so well. So thank you. And like I said, I've got some related episodes. I've got a really interesting one with Dr. Kari Nixon, who I learned about through your Psy Moms. She wrote a food shaming blog a while ago, and this episode's on food shaming and the medical humanities, which I didn't know what that was until I interviewed her. That's fascinating. And I have one on scientific justice. I have one on infant formula that I mentioned before. I have one on weight bias in healthcare with Dr. Fatima Cody Stanford, who's amazing. And then one of my favorite episodes of all time is about embracing cultural foods and flavors with dietitian Maya Feller. So, and of course, the MSG series. So is there anything else that you're working on? I mean, I hate to even say that because you just have spent how many years of, blood, sweat, and tears on this book. But yeah, anything else you want to share with us?
Yeah, I'm always working. I'm always reading research. I have a few stories relevant to the book that I'm pursuing, including following kind of some of what's going on with this pushback against pressure to exclusively breastfeed. I'm always nerding out on something, I guess you could say. So keeping up with me on, I wish there was like one place we could all keep up with each other, just like centrally. It's not the case anymore, but you can find me.
Yes, we will stay connected. And I encourage everybody to follow you on social. And yeah, I mean, keep fighting the good fight and putting the word out about evidence-based information. And looks like we might be doing a little bit more of that in the near future. So
yeah, as we navigate
this.
Yes,
yeah, absolutely. Kavin, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing everything about your new book. Congratulations on the book. And it's just been really great reconnecting with you.
Yes, you as well. Thank you.
And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind. Till next time.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. This podcast does not provide medical advice. It is for informational purposes only. Please see a registered dietitian for individualized advice. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag and Detroit Podcasts. Copyright Soundbites Inc., all rights reserved.